The tigers of Tagarthy. If you travel to the western limits of the district of Shimoga, in the state of Mysore, you will at once be struck by the difference of scenery, from that prevailing around Bangalore, and the eastern parts of the state. For here, you are within the belt of evergreen forests, fed by torrential monsoon rains, averaging above 120 inches a year, west of Shimoga town itself, and reaching over 250 inches at the village of Agum, the extreme limit of Mysore state on the western Ghats. Giant trees, their leafy tops reaching to high heaven, and colossal tree ferns, grow along the numerous streams that gush from forest and glen, and border the roadside, with a perennial supply of fresh water. Vegetation of the rankest description, among which the thorny varieties of the jungles of central and eastern South India are conspicuous by their absence, is to be seen everywhere. But little wandering in these jungles is possible, for trails do not exist, since the undergrowth densely covers every open space, and struggles ever upward to reach a ray of sunshine. Beneath the towering trees everything is damp and dark. The chirp of the wood cricket and croak of the bullfrog are the only sounds you will hear. Leeches, their bodies attached to the undersides of leaves, stretch out elastically to fasten a grip on any living creature that may brush by. They will penetrate your clothing, worm their way between the interstices of your boots, puttees or stockings, and suck your blood, without your being aware of their presence, for they give you no pain, until, looking downwards, you will find some part of yourself oozing blood. Attempt to pull them off, and they will leave a nasty wound, that generally festers into a sore. Apply a little of the common salt you should always carry on your person in these parts, or a little tobacco juice, and they will curl up, and fall off of their own accord. The wound will then heal without any attention. This is the home of the hamadryad or king cobra, Nyahana, as he is known, that giant snake of the cobra family, that reaches a length of 15 feet, and more. Dark olive green in color, with faint yellowish white circles around his body, he boasts of no visible mark on his dark, oval hood. Of amazing speed despite his great length, he feeds on other snakes, is aggressive, and is said to attack on sight, a female guarding her young, being reputed to be particularly bad-tempered. I have twice met the king cobra, on his own grounds, once when collecting specimens for an aquarium of the beautiful red and green fish, spotted along their sides, which inhabit the forest streams outside Agum, and on another occasion, when out collecting orchids. But, at neither time did they behave aggressively. Both specimens stopped upon seeing me, raised their heads about 4 feet above ground, and partly extended their oval hoods, while gazing at me attentively and inquisitively with their beady black eyes. Then they harmlessly glided on their way. The higher treetops are the homes of beautiful orchids, the stick-shaped branches of the dendrobium family being particularly represented. In summer, their clusters of pink, yellow, white or mauve blooms festoon the higher terraces in colorful array. This district embraces the Shiravati River, whose waters fall gracefully and grandiosely in 4 distinct streams, a sheer 950 feet at the falls of Gasopa or Jog. Here, on a moonlit night, can be seen that rare phenomenon, against the steaming spray of the waters a rainbow by moonlit. The village of Tagarthy, 11 miles southeast of the little town of Sagar, is situated on the eastern limits of the evergreen forests, where they have been felled, and cultivation has been undertaken. Because of the heavy rainfall and fertile earth, agricultural ventures in this area are extremely profitable. The grass also grows lusciously on the more open glades, and vast herds of cattle are kept in the bordering villages and hamlets, due to the abundant grazing. Relatively few wild animals, beyond bison, inhabit the evergreen forests, owing to the denseness of the undergrowth, and the presence of leeches and ticks, which annoy them. For the same reason, and due to the scarcity of game, carnivore are seldom encountered in those dark places. But as the area opens out, and the vast herds of cattle appear, carnivore collect in large numbers to feed on them, and grow fat. Tagarthy was such an area, and at no time in all my many visits were there less than 4 separate tigers in permanent residence. In February 1939 the peak figure of my experience was reached, with 8 cattle killed in one day, at various points of the compass around Tagarthy. This indicated 8 separate tigers operating, since the kills were reported from widely distant places. Due to the number of tigers in the locality, panthers are rarely met with, the one or two eking out their existence doing so in the immediate vicinity of the villages, and living on dogs, goats, and sometimes domestic fowls. For the tiger does not tolerate his smaller cousin, and will without compunction kill, and occasionally eat him, if the panther gets within striking distance. Except for spotted deer, game is comparatively scarce around Tagarthy, and the tigers in that area are mainly cattle lifters. Most of them are heavily built animals and fat, lacking the sleek, trim appearance of the true game killer. Let me tell you the story of Sham Rao Barpat of Tagarthy, and of the tiger that he shot in his garden, quite close to his house. Sham Rao was but a lad at the time, about 22 years, but as the sole male heir, he managed the estate that surrounded his home with efficiency, and with the true love of an agriculturist. Rice grew in the lower, muddy areas, while the dry crop of ragi was cultivated on higher levels. He also had a grove of areca, and coconut palms, up the stems of which clambered the beetle leaf vine. Moreover, Sham Rao had cattle, and other livestock, and indeed was a prosperous landlord. One day a fat tiger decided to share in this prosperity, and commenced killing Sham Rao's herd, one by one. Sham Rao possessed a smooth bore gun and nothing else, and loaded with ball, sat over the kills for the tiger's return. But for one reason or other this never happened, till it came to be surmised this particular tiger was an old, and who had probably been shot at before, and therefore would not return to his kill a second time. And then the tiger grew bolder. One dark night it leapt the fence surrounding Sham Rao's garden, and attempted to dislodge the stout bamboo screen, that had been closely drawn across the entrance to the cattle shed. Sham Rao had wakened at hearing the restless snorting, and stamping of his cattle. He had then detected a scratching sound, and going outside met the tiger, as it leapt away after having tried to force an entrance. The next night Sham Rao placed small cut branches on the roof of his cattle shed, where he lay prone on his stomach, 6 feet above the ground at the entrance to his shed. This entrance had been closed. At 10 o'clock, the tiger presented itself, and began scratching the door. Sham Rao fired both barrels of his smooth bore at point-blank range, and the marauder sank almost noiselessly to earth. He was a fine example of the heavy type of cattle-killing tiger. The scene changes. It was 11:30 a.m. and the sun shone brilliantly down on the little forest bungalow, situated some 2.5 miles from Tagarthy itself. Early lunch was nearly ready, and my wife was busy, with the few finishing touches. Just then, a kaka voiced his grating call from the forest, that bordered the bungalow fencing. Again, and again the call was repeated, the excited note of the small deer betraying his intense alarm. Slipping on a pair of rubber boots, and carrying the rifle, I crossed the forest fire line, and penetrated the leafy depths of the jungle. The kaka was still calling, and I went forward as fast as was possible, making the minimum of noise. I came upon a clearing, in the midst of which stood the little kaka facing away from me, and voicing his intermittent bark. Slipping back into the jungle, I tiptoed around the clearing, careful not to place myself within the direct vision of the alarmed deer. Some teak trees had been planted here, and their huge leaves, dry and brittle at this season, lay where they had fallen, carpeting the forest floor. I knew that, to attempt to cross them would be to give myself away. So I hid behind the trunk of a stout fig tree, growing on the edge of the teak, and strove to penetrate the shadows under them. Stare as I could, for a while I saw nothing. Then a little distance away something stirred, and in doing so gave itself away. I focused my eyes on the spot, and there I saw a tiger, lying unconcernedly on his back, all 4 feet in the air, and apparently fast asleep. Periodically the tip of his tail would twitch, and it was this movement that had caught my eye, and betrayed his presence. It would have been unsportsmanlike, to shoot the animal in his sleep. Besides, he was doing no harm beyond killing his lawful food, and so I was not disposed to cause him any hurt. I leant my rifle against the tree, and myself also, and for quite 20 minutes I watched that tiger sound asleep on his back. And then from the forest lodge floated my wife's voice, calling me for lunch. The tiger heard it, and sat up, turning his head towards the sound, his eyes still half closed with sleep. Silently, I stepped from concealment, the rifle ready for all eventualities. The tiger heard me, leapt to his feet, and whisked around to gaze in blank surprise at this human, who had come so close to him undiscovered. Then with a lazy snarl, he began to walk casually away. I let him go peacefully, and soon he was lost to sight. On another occasion my wife and I had hired a bullock cart, and had gone out at night shining torches, to see what we could see. We had traveled a mile, and were halfway down a deep declivity, where the cart track crossed a stream, when she picked up a pair of eyes reflecting her torch beam. Deep in the jungle to our right. Halting our cart, we dismounted, she leading the way with the torch, with me behind with the rifle. The eyes had disappeared, so we followed a narrow footpath that led at an angle in the general direction of the spot where the eyes had been. Shortly we picked them up again, large reddish-white orbs, glowing distinctly against the background of night. Fortunately, the undergrowth was thin just there, and we were able to advance directly towards the eyes. A few steps further, and out stepped a tiger, who looked at us, and then back at the place from which it had just emerged. The mystery of this strange behavior was soon unraveled, for two cubs, the size of retrievers, broke cover, and gambled up to their mother. She now gazed at us fixedly a few moments, and then crossed into the jungle, uttering a low mewing sound, a call to the cubs to follow. They did so, and the trio were lost in the forest, except for the rustle of the undergrowth that occasionally marked their progress through the bushes. My wife kept her torch beam in the general direction, where we could hear them moving, for fear that the tigress, resenting our intrusion, should change her mind, and launch a flank attack. Then we both heard a distinct growl before us. Turning the beam towards this new sound, we were shaken at seeing another tiger, this time a large male, at almost the spot where the tigress had stood a few seconds before. Quite evidently, we had come upon a family party, returning from quenching their thirst at the stream. I might observe that it is quite unusual, however, for a male tiger to accompany a tigress with cubs of the size we had just seen. Generally, she will not trust her offspring near her lord, till they are fairly well grown. The situation was now decidedly tense, as there was every possibility of one or other adult animal attacking us. My wife kept her head with commendable calmness, however, and the tiger, growling in a low tone, followed his family into the undergrowth. At that time occurred an amusing sequel to the story, which might have had an unpleasant ending but happily did not. The unfortunate cart driver, left alone in the dark, had heard the mewing of the tigress, followed by the growl of her mate. Perhaps his bullocks then scented them, or even saw them, for suddenly they bolted with the cart, to rush pell-mell down into the bed of the stream, where the wheels stuck fast in the soft sand and water. Hearing the shouts of the cart man, and thinking he or his bulls had been attacked, we ran to the spot, to discover all was well except for the severe fright he had received. We were both glad that circumstances had not forced us to harm any of the members of that happy family party. For some time my friend, Dr. Stanley of the Mysore Medical Service, was stationed by his department at Tagarthy, principally to attempt to stem the tide of malaria, which was rife, and affecting practically every one of the inhabitants. The doctor was an enterprising man, keen on shooting, and has shot quite a few tigers during his service. Late one night, he received a maternity call, from a hamlet called Bellandur, about 6 miles away. True to his profession, he set forth by bullock cart, armed with his bag of medicines, injections, and bandages, his gecko smoothbore, and a 5-cell torch added a touch of shakar to his duty. They were traversing an intervening valley, when a tiger leapt across the track, and sitting on its haunches by the wayside, turned to watch the passing cart. Stanley fired ball at the animal, which received the lead with a loud roar, and disappeared. Calmly, he went on to his destination, relieved the mother of her baby, and spent the rest of the night with the patient, returning next morning, with a small boy of his acquaintance to help him, and the cart man to follow up the tiger he had wounded the night before. Coming to the spot, they soon picked up a blood trail, which they began to follow, the cart man turning back to his cart on the plea he could not leave his bullocks alone. Stanley and the boy had gone some distance, and entered a hollow, when they unexpectedly came upon the tiger, lying on its side before them. Thinking it was dead, but to make certain, Stanley fired an LG into its rear, when the tiger came to life, turned round, and charged them. As it leapt, Stanley fired his remaining barrel, this time ball, into the mouth of the tiger. Then it was on him, knocking him down, and laying bare a portion of the back of his skull. At this moment the boy fled screaming, thus undoubtedly saving Stanley's life, for the tiger left him, and chased the boy, whom in turn it sprang upon, biting into his side. Dazed from the wound in his head, Stanley scrambled to his feet, and fumbled to reload his gun, when, unexpectedly, the tiger left the boy, and jumped into the jungle. The youngster had been badly wounded in the back and side, and blood was bubbling out of the gaping holes made by two of the great fangs. In addition, 3 ribs were broken. Using his torn shirt for bandages, Stanley patched him up as well as possible, and carried him to the bullock cart, and the long journey of 17 miles was begun to the town of Sagar, the doctor himself being in a bad way all the while. From there they entrained for Shimoga, about 35 miles away, where was a district hospital. It is sufficient to record that both of them recovered from their adventure, Stanley to receive a severe wigging from his medical superior, who reminded him he had been stationed at Tagarthy as a doctor, and not to shoot tigers. Their fortunate escapes were undoubtedly due to the fact that the tiger had been severely wounded. Stanley's last shot into its mouth had very probably smashed the lower jaw, for it was noticeable that in both attacks thereafter, it had used only its upper canines. Had the lower jaw been serviceable, there is no doubt whatever that both Stanley and the boy would not have lived to see another sunrise. As it was, many villagers heard the wounded animal for a week thereafter, roaring night and day in agony. Then there was silence, and there is every likelihood that it crawled away into the depths of the forest to die, for the carcass was never found. Stanley also told me of 2 other experiences at Tagarthy. Once while sitting on a macan over a kill, nearing sunset, a hamadryad climbed the tree, in which he was stationed. He frightened it away, but as darkness descended, thinking the great snake might come back, and feeling very uneasy, he returned to the village. On another occasion, while sitting imperfectly concealed over a kill, the tiger had seen him, and had demonstrated all night until the early hours of morning, circling the tree, and roaring continuously. This had become a nuisance, as a drizzle set in, but the good doctor, very wisely, had not risked returning alone in the dark, when he had such an aggressive tiger to deal with. When wandering in the few areas around Tagarthy, where the forest is at all penetrable, I have myself come upon a 3/4 grown tigress, lying dead in a clearing, with 23 porcupine quills embedded in her face and chest. One of them had completely penetrated, and extinguished the right eye. The tigress was in an extremely emaciated condition. A few feet away was the half-devoured carcass of a panther. The tragedy was not difficult to piece together. Evidently, the tigress had attempted to make a meal of a porcupine, which had charged backwards into her face, as these animals do, embedding its quills in her head and chest, and putting out one eye. Blinded, starving, and still carrying the quills from the last encounter, the tigress had wandered desperately in search of food. Then she had come upon the panther, whom she had attacked, fought, killed, and begun to eat, when death had overtaken her, for some unaccountable reason, perhaps through stomach or other injuries caused by the panther itself, not clearly evident to me, from her decomposed carcass. In the hamlet of Bellendur, lived a mysterious individual named Buddia, accredited by local inhabitants with great powers of witchcraft and black magic. He was reputed to have bewitched people, and brought about the deaths. He was a great friend of mine, and after one of our many intimate talks late one night, he presented me with a circle of plaited creeper stems, 4 inches in diameter, made from mysterious plants that grow, he said, deep inside the forest. He asked me to keep this with me always, on my hunting trips, and said that if any time I was in an area where game did not show up, I was to wait till the sun had set, and then pass the circle 3 times up and down the barrel of my gun. Within 24 hours, he guaranteed, I would kill something with that weapon. I still have that circle and am ashamed to confess have used it, more than once, where game has been scarce, in accordance with the directions of its giver. Call it coincidence or luck, as you wish, but it has never failed to produce results. Alas, old Buddia is now no more, having succumbed to the dread scourge of malaria, from which even his powers of magic could not protect him. Now, let me tell you about the Tiger of Gaia. Gaia is another tiny hamlet, over 6 miles from Tagarthy, and halfway to the forest choki of Amlagola, situated on the borders of the Great Tiger Preserve of Karadibata, carefully protected by His Highness the Maharaja of Mysore for his own shooting. tigers are not so clever as to know that they should remain within the limits of certain boundaries. Most important of all, no cattle are permitted into the Karadibata Preserve, and tigers like eating cattle immensely. Just outside the hallowed precincts are cattle by the hundred, so what more natural than that there should be more tigers outside of the preserve than within it? About 1938, a particularly enterprising tiger walked out of the preserve, and started killing cattle around Amnagola, returning afterwards to the preserve where he was safe and sound from molestation. In this manner he waxed fat, while his fame as a devourer of sleek cows spread throughout the area. Then, as happens with humans, continued success induced greater daring, disregard for consequences, and finally that rank carelessness and overconfidence that brings undoing to both tigers and men. Our tiger had not yet reached this last stage, though he was well on the way, for he wandered farther and farther from the protecting fastnesses of Karadibata, and disdained to return there during the daytime, as had been his custom hitherto. In this way he came to Gaia, where he took up his temporary abode on the banks of a deep nullah that scored the countryside about 1.5 miles from the hamlet. From this shelter, he raided the cattle herds, harrying them morning and evening, never failing to kill at least 2 fat cattle each week. Letters had been written to me about this slayer, but I had never bothered unduly about his activities, for after all tigers must eat to live, and this old fellow was doing no harm to humans. A few less cattle mattered little to those vast herds. With the passage of time, however, his daring increased still more, and the last reports showed that he was loath to leave his kills, demonstrating loudly by roaring, and making short rushes at the herdsmen, when they attempted to drive him off. True it was that hitherto, he had not hurt anyone, but I knew from the preliminary indications, that this would happen almost any day now. Sooner or later, another man-eater would appear. At 9:30 a.m. one morning, therefore, I alighted from the mail train from Bangalore, at the wayside railway shed of Adari. From here a walk of 3.5 miles brought me to Tagarthy. I was greeted by old friends, and hospitably treated to coffee, while a hot meal was being prepared. I occupied the time by gleaning all the news I could, but this did not amount to much, beyond the usual account of the presence of tiger in all directions, the daring old tiger of Gaia having earned particular notoriety. After the meal, I set forth by car to cover the 6-odd miles to Gaia, which, because the track was in a very bad way, we did not reach till 6 p.m. While talking with the inhabitants, my tent was erected about 3 furlongs away, on the banks of a smaller nullah, that fed the main stream. The tiger lived a mile or so beyond. I was told that the tiger had killed 2 days before. Nothing had happened since, but the next kill was undoubtedly due within the coming 48 hours. Sure enough, word was brought at 1 p.m. next day that the tiger had just claimed another victim. Hurrying to the spot, I found the tiger had attacked a cow in the middle of an open field, quite 300 yards from the nearest cover, killed it and carried it away to its hiding place, which proved to be the very same nullah as that in which my tent was pitched. Soft sand, and of the nullah revealed tracks where the tiger had crept along the bed, and then dashed over the bank towards the cow. The cow had run a short distance in an effort to escape, but had been overtaken and slain. The tiger had then lifted the cow across its back, and returned to the ravine, as was evident by the absence of any drag mark, though the tiger's pugs were firmer, and had sunk deeper into the rough clods of the ploughed field, due to the weight he was carrying. I cautiously followed the tracks in the hope of encountering the animal or his kill. This I eventually did, but he did not demonstrate and show himself, as I expected he would. That indefinable sixth sense, which warns the jungle folk in the nick of time, evidently impressed this tiger that here was a human being, to whom he should not show himself. While still some yards away in the undergrowth, and invisible to me, he became aware of my presence, growled in a low tone, and slunk away. There was a suitable tree nearby, and I arranged the erection of my charpoy makan. I was in position by 4 p.m. The tiger came at 8, but stood directly under my makan, and beside the tree on which I sat. I knew of his approach, by the subtle sound of his tread. No dry leaves crackled to betray his coming, but in the stillness of the silent night, there was no mistaking that soft heavy footfall. He began to lick himself, his rough tongue running over his glossy coat, making the faintest of rasping sounds. Then he arose on his hind legs, and began to clean and sharpen the claws of his forefeet against the bole of the tree. In so doing, he saw the Macan above. A low growl and he was gone, nor did he return that night. The following day nothing happened, so in the afternoon I tethered a heifer in the bed of the main nullah, where he was reputed to have his abode, and sat up on a Macan in a tree overhanging the nullah, at an angle of 60 degrees. I was in position at 3 p.m., and 5:30 p.m. I heard a dragging sound, and there was the tiger hauling down the bank, another cow he had taken from one of the herds. He was quite 80 yards away. Aiming at his neck, I fired, but as I did so the tiger moved forward, receiving the bullet much further back than was necessary for a fatal shot. He responded to the impact with a coughing grunt, and catapulted to the bottom of the nullah, and was gone. I descended the tree, released my bait, and returned to Gaia in the opposite direction, feeling confident I would locate and bag him next morning without undue trouble. But I was very much mistaken, as events were to show. At dawn, I was back at the scene of action, accompanied by 2 reliable locals from the hamlet. We picked up the tiger's blood trail at the foot of the nullah, which traversed its bed for some considerable distance before climbing the opposite bank. We followed with every caution, but soon found that the animal had kept going, for there was no evidence that he had sat down to rest from his wound. It was almost 2 miles before he had eventually halted for the first time, feeling the effects of the bullet. He had then got up and continued, and I guessed that he was making for Amlagola and the tiger preserve beyond. Once he reached this, I knew he was lost, since to carry firearms into the preserve, even in pursuit of a wounded tiger, was strictly prohibited. He had had a full night's start of us, and despite his wound it looked as if he might gain the sanctuary of the preserve after all. Pressing forward, we came upon 2 more places where he had rested. At the first of these there was considerable blood, and the grass was flattened where he had been lying. At the second there was much less blood, and thereafter the trail became more difficult to follow. Evidently the flow of blood was stopping. Perhaps the layer of fat beneath the outer skin had worked itself into the bullet hole, and had stopped the profuse bleeding. We soon found ourselves in the precincts of Amlagola, and I knew the tiger had now but a mile to go before reaching the forest fire line that marked the western boundary of the preserve. Here fortune favored us, for we encountered a stream, at that time holding pools of water. The pugs of the tiger on the soft sand showed that he had now changed his mind about heading for the preserve, and had gone upstream instead in search of water. We followed, and came upon the first pool, at which he had drunk, and had lain up for quite a considerable time thereafter, for the tracks leaving this place were comparatively fresh, and had been made within the hour. This fact renewed our flagging hopes, and we continued for a furlong before coming upon a second pool, where the tiger had also halted. Water still seeped through the indentations of the pugs, and it was now clear he was but a little distance ahead. He might even have heard us coming, and had just moved forward. I determined to try strategy rather than follow in his wake, for I greatly feared that he might turn tail, and bolt for the sanctuary, which lay so close to this spot. Motioning to my 2 companions to climb into a tree, I ascended the bank of the nullah soundlessly, and doubled forward in a detour as hard as I could go, parallel to the line of the nullah. I rejoined the nullah half a mile down its course, and tiptoed backwards in the hope of surprising the tiger. But I was doomed to disappointment, for he heard or saw me, and scampered up the bank, and towards the preserve, as I had feared. I followed his blood trail to where he had entered a patch of dense scrub, which I circled, halting behind the trunk of a tree at the far end. Here I waited, but nothing emerged. If I attempted to summon my men I would alarm the tiger, and I was in a quandary as to what to do next. Very obligingly he provided the solution by moving, as I noticed the grass before me wave to his forward motion, although not a glimpse of his body was visible. The grass continued to wave as he crept away at an angle, so I left my protecting tree, and stole forward myself. The grass began to thin then, and at last, I saw him, just as he saw me. I fired at his flank, and with a roar, he charged. But within 5 paces his courage failed, and he turned to receive a third shot, which took him pell-mell into the thicket from which he had just emerged. I whistled to the men, who had heard the shots, and were themselves bravely coming forward. When they had joined me, I explained the situation, and told them to climb to the tops of the neighboring trees, in an effort to locate the tiger. This they did, but signaled that they could see nothing. I then posted them up, 2 separate trees about 50 yards apart, after telling them to whistle if they saw our quarry, and returned to the nullah myself, in case the tiger should have gone back. It was a nasty business negotiating that narrow ravine, not knowing at what moment the tiger might spring upon me from the bank above or from behind one of the boulders, which strewed its course. One of the fundamental principles in following a wounded tiger is never to negotiate the bed of a stream alone, when the wounded animal might be lurking above. But I was desperate, having spent the whole day in following this wounded beast, and feared that yet, at the last moment, it might escape me by dragging itself away to die in Karadibata. So, with bated breath and rifle cocked, and with my finger closed around trigger, I negotiated that stream, to find the tiger had not reclosed it, and was still inside the thicket into which it had jumped. How to dislodge him was now the problem. Returning, and summoning the men, we held a council of war. To follow the tiger into the midst of the thicket, without knowing at least its approximate location would be suicidal, and then came inspiration. Returning to the stream, I removed my shirt, knotted the sleeves together, and tied up the neck. Using it as a bag, we filled it with pebbles to breaking point. Then one of the men carried it back, to where I had last fired at the tiger. With this store of ammunition, we began stoning the thicket in all directions, till at last we were answered by a warning growl, from the bushes to the right of the point where we stood, and about 30 yards away. Evidently, the tiger was severely wounded, and could not move, for he did not rush out at us, but continued to answer each stone that fell near him with a series of growls. Whispering to the men to stone intermittently to hold his attention, I made a detour of the thicket, and began to enter it from the direction of the nullah. I could hear the tiger growling before me, and the occasional fall of the river stones that were hurled by my henchmen. As long as I could hear the tiger, I made progress, although the thicket was dense, for I knew his attention was otherwise held. But then, as I drew nearer, he heard me, for his growling stopped. My followers also noticed this, and guessed that he had heard or sensed my approach from the rear. In an effort to distract him, they threw the stones higher, further, and faster, but without result, for the tiger would not give himself away. I knew I would have to be extremely careful, as he might now attack me at any moment. I halted, every sense alert, straining my ears to hear the faintest rustle preliminary to the last great bound that would bring him upon me. Nothing happened, and as the seconds rolled by in silence, broken only by the sound of the dropping stones, my nervous tension mounted, and I became oppressed by an overpowering sense of impending danger. I glanced in all directions, but could detect no movement. I strained my ears, but could hear nothing. Still that sense of approaching peril grew stronger, and stronger, till I could have shouted aloud to break the unnatural silence, or have turned tail and run. And then I glanced behind me. There between 2 bushes was the wounded tiger, reddened with its own blood as it crawled on its belly to surprise me with its last great spring. Our eyes met, it roared and launched itself into the air, while the Winchester cracked twice, hurling its powerful bullets right into the face of the oncoming fury. I sidestepped as the heavy body crashed before me, kicked wildly in the air, and then lay still, as I sped yet another bullet into its heart at point-blank range. The troublesome old tiger of Gaia had failed to reach the sanctuary of Karadibata, and was now no more.